Hey guys, I'm Taya with Whiskey Watch, and I'm going to talk to you today about the difference between bourbon and rye whiskey. So both bourbon and rye whiskey have roots in American history. There's a really great book that I recommend anyone who cares about whiskey, particularly the history of American whiskey and bourbon specifically, to read. It's called Bourbon Empire by Reed Mittenbuehler. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, but it's a wonderful book. Highly recommend it. And it breaks down a lot of American history and how European immigrants brought their trades over, and one of those really amazing trades was the ability to distill spirits, and how they came over and started using what they had to make familiar spirits that were of course a little different because they had new grains, new ways of distilling, new ways of aging, etc. But for this particular segment, I'm just going to talk about the difference between bourbon and rye. And the biggest and most important difference, which changes the flavor profile of both dramatically, is the mash bill. Bourbon's mash bill must be 51% or more corn. The rest of the mash doesn't matter. And rye must have a mash bill of 51% or more rye, where the mash bill, the rest of it doesn't matter. There is such a thing as 100% rye, but of course there's no real such thing as 100% bourbon, but there is such a thing as corn whiskey. So it's kind of the same thing, different names, semantics at a certain point. Bourbon must be aged at least 2 years in charred American virgin oak barrels, and rye must also be aged in those same virgin American oak barrels at least 2 years. So in a lot of ways they're pretty similar, but rye, because it has a higher rye content than bourbon, which could conceivably not have any rye in it at all, such as the corn whiskey I just mentioned, and any kind of wheated bourbon like a Weller 12-year and Maker's Mark, for example, Pappy Van Winkle, no rye in those. So they can be quite different. And the difference is that rye tends to bring a hotter, spicier, and sometimes it's described as even a more fruity taste. Bourbons tend to be more soft, more caramelly. They really play well with the wood notes from their American oak barrels. The rye does as well, and I think that the oak really mellows any of the heat from the rye as well, but it's still a spicier, hotter drink than most bourbons. Another interesting fact that concerns both rye and bourbon is that neither are allowed to be distilled at anything higher than 160 proof. Another difference that is kind of interesting to those of you who are interested in the fermentation process, bourbons sometimes they'll introduce mash from a former batch of bourbon. This is not done with all bourbons, and it's never done with ryes. We do have sort of an American myth that bourbon was not popular until after Prohibition, and before that rye was more popular, and that's not true. And I'd really like to read an excerpt from this bourbon Bible for me, the Bourbon Empire book, about the history of rye and its revival in America. Rye's welcome revival this century has been accompanied by a modern myth that it was America's dominant whiskey up until Prohibition. In 1878, some of the earliest official records separating bourbon and rye production show bourbon owning 70% of the market. In 1902, rye briefly surpassed bourbon by 1.5%, but bourbon quickly resumed its dominance the year after. In any case, the absence of strict labeling regulations meant that whiskey was sometimes marked as rye in the East and bourbon in the West and South, no matter what was actually in the bottle, sometimes confusing the label. So rye might have been more popular in certain areas, but they also might have been drinking bourbon, which they believed was rye the whole time. So it's hard to know which was more popular, but bourbon does tend to be the general crowd pleaser and something that tends to be more popular, especially in recent years. Canadian rye gained popularity during Prohibition. That is true, and that's because Canada didn't have Prohibition. So people were producing up there and bringing it illegally down here. So that's just kind of a fun fact. Okay, and I'm gonna end with some of my favorites of each of these delicious whiskeys. For bourbon, I'm a huge Buffalo Trace fan. I love Blanton's. I got the opportunity to try Weller 12-year and of course anything from Pappy, so delicious. But those are probably my favorites. For rye, I love Sazerac rye. Nothing makes a better Sazerac cocktail. I love Templeton. Rittenhouse is another good one that's really reasonably priced, and so is Old Overholt bottled in bond. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, because Rittenhouse rye and Old Overholt bottled in bond are bottled in bond. However, Old Overholt also has a rye that is not bottled in bond. Bottled in bond really just means that the product was produced and aged and stored in a manner that is adhering to the legal regulations of the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897. And you might notice something about that year based off the excerpt that I just read. That's right. In 1878, some of the earliest official records separating bourbon and rye production show bourbon owning 70%. 1878, that's when the record started. And in 1897, we start bottling in bond, which was really regulating and making sure people weren't sneaking things that shouldn't be in the whiskey to make more product, or to make their product stretch further. And then we have in 1902 that rye was briefly surpassed bourbon in popularity by only 1.5%. So all this was kind of happening at the same time, which is really interesting to me. The whiskey boom of the 2000s is not the first whiskey boom that America has seen. So just to sum it up, bourbon and rye are both really yummy whiskeys, two of my favorite. Actually, they are my two favorites. And if you haven't read this book, Bourbon Empire I'm so sorry, I'm gonna just ruin your last name again. Read Mittenbuler, I'm sorry. It's excellent, and it's a really awesome history of American whiskey overall, bourbon and rye, and a little bit of Canadian whiskey, and a lot of prohibition. So highly recommend that, and I'd love to hear if there's anything else that you guys want to learn about. Thanks for tuning in, and have a good one.